Let's start with a big question, which is when does human life begin? Can you help us to answer that question from both a professional and a Christian perspective?
I think it's such a simple question, but such a profound one. And I think it is a question that every Christian needs to reflect on and come up with an answer, because like all issues, one has to have one's foundations right before one can grapple with some of the images, with some of the challenges that arise. I suppose over the years, I'm committed and convicted with the view that life begins at conception. We know biblically, if we reflect on Psalm 139, that intimacy between God and the unborn David. But elsewhere in the Bible, most compellingly, I find for Jesus to become fully human, it was his conception that was announced. The Bible isn't silent on that. And I think if I were asked one reason why I believe life begins at conception, it's the example of Christ himself. The circumstances, the nature, and his conception is so integral to him becoming human, such that that's what I take away. And so that is what shapes me professionally when coming to decisions about beginning of life issues. That is the view with which I'm convicted, both scripturally and applied professionally.
Let's just think a bit more about that. So if life does begin at conception, we live in an age where most couples have so many scans and prenatal tests during the pregnancy. Can you help us think through that? What are your thoughts on this, and how do you care for couples who perhaps during those testing find some potential abnormalities in the unborn child?
So this is certainly an increasingly fraught area, and it's again an area where, as Christians, I think it's so important that one reflects and grapples with these issues before embarking on what is sometimes, I think, a little bit of a treadmill and an expected pathway from those who provide care. So there are many, many tests that are now available. In the past, that was often simply an ultrasound. It's progressed through to amniocentesis, counting of chromosomes. It's progressed now beyond tests in pregnancy itself. Mackenzie's mission is a very large enterprise that is being heavily promoted, which is about testing genes in the mother and the father to see whether there could be any potential for genetic conditions. And if there are, offering cycles of IVF and selecting embryos that don't carry such a genetic complement. As Christians, it's therefore very necessary to think about, when does life begin? When is a baby imbued with that being created in the image of God? And how does that affect any decisions about the significance of an unborn child, regardless of what its genes may tell us? And I think these are issues that technology has far outpaced the reflectiveness we have in society generally, and even in Christian communities.
I think one of the problems, as Jonathan says, there are so many tests, and a lot of people having the test, a lot of these pregnant women, don't realize that some are to make sure the baby's healthy and the mother's healthy, but some are to see whether there are any abnormalities. And there is an unspoken assumption in many places that if there is an abnormality, you'll consider termination of the pregnancy. And I think the question of whether you want to have those tests is one that more people need to think about. But because of pressures on time for doctors, is a lot of women aren't fully informed of what is involved in the test they're having at the time of the test. And as these genetic tests become more and more complex and look at more and more different conditions, it's going to be harder and harder for people to understand before the event whether or not they actually want to have those tests, because if they're then presented with abnormal results, that can be extremely difficult if they haven't prepared themselves for the fact that these things are actually being examined.
Can we just talk a bit more about that? It's an emotive issue, but termination of pregnancy or abortions, any wisdom there to how we should think Christianly on this issue?
I think with many of these issues, obviously we need to be loving, we need to be compassionate, we need to be sensitive, but within a truthful framework, a biblically truthful framework. If one holds the view that life begins at conception, obviously an unborn child, no matter what stage of pregnancy, is something to be protected, to be nurtured. And with that framework, though, I think there's also a compulsion on us to offer alternatives. I think, we do need to reflect on what we are doing to promote support of children who potentially could be born and nurtured in another environment. We need to ask where in our churches are the developmentally disabled. Where are our services? How are we supporting those? Because I think to be truly loving and compassionate, it's just not being non-supportive of abortion, but it's about offering alternatives and living as a community, ensuring that everyone in that community is supported, loved, and nurtured. And I think that's the challenge for us, particularly as we see secular society going in such a different direction. Some European countries now in the world have essentially ensured there are no children with Down syndrome in their community. And I think that's a really worrying precedent of what may come.
There are some really great initiatives starting in Sydney, training churches for how to be inclusive of disabled members of the congregation, which come from disabled communities. And I think it'd be great to see more uptake of that training so we get better at it. Because if we are saying to people, we think you do need to keep this child who has a disability, we need to support them once the birth has occurred. And one piece of advice Jonathan gave me that I thought I found very helpful when I talk to people is that if you have an opportunity, if you find out the child you're carrying has a problem, meeting a family who have a child with that particular problem can make it so much more doable than just the theoretical knowledge about that problem. And I think that's something that in the literature, it's shown that if you can see someone coping with a child with this problem, it makes it much more possible for the couple with the child with this problem.
Can we think about the issue of those people who are struggling with infertility? So sadly, many couples today struggle to conceive. What are some advice on the Christian attitudes towards IVF or other technologies today? And then partially, how do you walk alongside couples who are really struggling with infertility?
The first thing is to recognize what aspects of reproductive enhancement involve the creation of life and which ones just increase the probability of a healthy egg meeting a healthy sperm. So it's important to understand, if one takes the view that life begins at conception, what enhancements are there that just may increase the likelihood of conception. And I think we would all be very comfortable with those approaches. I think for those couples who have faced lengthy infertility, Firstly, don't lose hope. It's often said as many people fall pregnant on the waiting list for IVF than with IVF itself. And certainly Megan, I'm sure, has seen that, and that I've seen that. I've seen many people who, after one cycle of IVF and a child, have had subsequent spontaneous pregnancies. So there is always hope. I think beyond that, before embarking upon IVF, one does have to be very clear about principles about when does life begin? Is this process going to result in the destruction of embryos? And is that acceptable? And that, to me, is the real tension in IVF, because many of the IVF companies essentially operate by the creation of many, many embryos, many of which will never see implantation. They're selected. And there are many aspects of IVF that raise really significant concerns from a biblical theological point of view. But obviously, we need to love those couples who struggle with this. It's something that, until one lives through things, and I guess from my own life, I know you think you know about something, but until you've lived through it, you don't understand.
Absolutely. I get contacted nearly every week by a Christian couple who've developed an ethical problem within their IVF treatment. I just can't tell you how many people have contacted me about this. And I think the main principle I would recommend is that you research IVF before you start, because some of these problems, such as having excess embryos, you need to be forewarned to be able to avoid that problem, because once the problem develops, there's no way around it. You could have a dozen embryos made for one couple, because when you walk into the clinic and you've struggled with infertility for so long, the concept that you might have more embryos than you want is just completely foreign to you. Mm-hmm. And I think people are very emotionally vulnerable at the time they start treatment, and will be agreeable to anything that's suggested. So unless you're aware at the outset that the principle I think holds good is to say, don't have more embryos created than you would be willing to have as children. And then you will need to fight for your embryos. You will be seen as the problem family, because you will go against the way they usually operate. But that's what you'll need to do for your embryos. And I think the other principle I'd like to say is that you don't have to go to IVF if you are an infertile Christian couple. You are a complete family without children. And I think that the inclusion of other people into what is supposed to be very intimate process of creating a child is quite difficult for a lot of people. IVF is expensive, it's stressful, it can have medical complications. It is not obligatory to go down the IVF route just because you're a Christian couple without children.
Thank you. Can we just go to the end of life? We looked a few weeks ago about our bodies and how, as we age, our bodies are decaying and failing, and then death is a reality for all of us. That in our culture at the moment, there's been a championing of what's called assisted dying or euthanasia over recent years. Can you help us think biblically about that and how to respond for this push for legalized euthanasia?
I think what's happening is in our society we're death denying, we're death fearing, and there is also a great fear of becoming dependent on another person. Individualism is being pushed so hard that we have this idea that to ever be dependent on someone else is a bad thing. And I think that the push for voluntary assisted dying is a push for control over the timing and manner of your death. As you say, we're all going to get older, we're all going to die. And I think that there is a group of people in our society who are very scared of becoming dependent and possibly having physical problems at the end of life within which they'd find it very difficult to cope. I would like to say that in the places where euthanasia is legal, it's very rare that someone requests it for a physical problem such as pain. The main reason people ask for assisted dying is because of existential problems such as fear of being a burden, fear of being alone, fear of things that haven't happened, but the anticipated problems. And the fear of the dying process has increased as proponents of euthanasia legislation keep giving us story after story of bad deaths. As a palliative care doctor, I know that there is an enormous amount that can be done to help people physically towards the end of life, but less than half the people in Australia who would benefit from palliative care actually receive it. And so we have this sort of a bit of a roundabout where people see a bad death, they're very scared of death and they want control. And in Victoria, where the legislation's been running now for a couple of years, we're seeing that also, that it's existential problems are pushing people to request voluntary assisted dying under their laws.
Can you talk a bit more about palliative care? So what is the alternative or Christian approach to dying well?
It's only very recently that we've stopped having a lot of teaching in the church about what is a good death. But in fact, back to the Middle Ages, there were books and treatises and lots of teaching about how at those times a rapid sort of a sudden death would be seen as a bad thing, whereas we all think, oh, I want to die in my sleep, or when I don't even know what's happening. Back in the past, people wanted time before they died so that they could make peace with God and their fellow men. And so I think as Christians, we know that Christ has taken away the fear of death. We see that in Hebrews 2. And death is not natural. It's not what God intended for us. We don't have to be happy about death, but we don't have to fear it. And Martin Luther said that you need to see death as a new beginning rather than the end. But we shouldn't despise our bodies in our temporal life. It's important before we die that we make our peace with, and being reminded of the promises of God, I think is very important at the end. And also, it's a time when we need to make peace within our own horizontal relationships. It's the time to say, I'm sorry, will you forgive me? I forgive you, I love you. And to leave your affairs in the best possible order as you approach the end of life. And the things that I think give Christians great comfort is just a reminder of the faithfulness of God and the presence of friends and family. Jesus, reminds us, I was sick and you visited me. The importance of us not forgetting those who are old, who are sick, who possibly have dementia and don't know who you are. The tragedy is not that they forget us. The tragedy is that we forget them.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today and sharing your heart. We're very thankful for the work that you both do. And I'm going to close this in prayer. Father, thank you for both Jonathan and Megan, and for the way that you have lavished them with your love and your mercy and your grace. And thank you for the expertise that you've given them. We pray that as they walk alongside people in both the beginning and the end of life issues, that you would give them your Spirit's wisdom and discernment as they teach, as they speak, as they care. And Lord, would you help each of us to think wisely on these issues? And we ask that for Jesus' sake. Amen.